Welcome back and thank you for joining us again. You may not know, but now we have 3 independent councillors on Eastbourne Borough Council. Today we talk to Jon Dow, Old Town councillor and previously the lead for climate change. We talked to him about what led him to be a councillor and what it's really like, why he recently resigned from the Lib Dem group over the council's position on the Eastbourne Airshow, and why he hopes for more independent councillors and changes in allowances to enable a greater diversity of talented individuals to step forward for election. Welcome, Jon. Good to see you. So I'm with Jon Dow, who is a councillor with Eastbourne Borough Council, and we want to chat really to introduce people to the truth about what being a councillor is, what it means, and the commitment, because I think a lot of people don't understand the commitment that councillors make. I think we'll perhaps start with, what was your reasons for becoming a councillor and when did that happen?
I suppose I started doing, I was brought up and raised in Eastbourne, so I'm an Eastbourne boy through and through. And I've always done community work, some of which was quite low impact stuff, which ultimately led me to become a governor at a school that my children went to. Got more involved in that, did some leadership qualifications, became a chair of governor and a chair of governor trainer, which actually turned out to be I trained one, or supported one of the members of staff at the council, funny enough. And through work, I ran my own business. I met Stephen Lloyd when he ran the 100 Apprentices in 100 Days campaign, which I really applauded and thought was a great initiative. And we got behind that and we took on two apprentices through that scheme. So Stephen and I sort of got to know each other, not particularly well, but got to know each other. And he asked if I would stand for election, which I had intended to do, if I'm honest, but not till 2019, but this was back in 2014-15. And he said it was a small commitment. It wasn't much of a role, and it would probably take 5 hours a week. And just reminiscing for a second, after I got elected, I saw him a few weeks later, and he came over and sort of said hello. And as he did, he put his hand over my shoulder and we shook hands. And I pulled him closer and said, you said this was 5 hours a week. I said, it's bloody 25, 30 hours a week. And he goes, I know. It's the only time I lie. He says, if I told the truth, no one would ever do it. And I thought, yeah, interesting one, that one, because it's how do you set the scene for what the true role of a borough councillor is? And this was all light-hearted, and I'm not trying to make a point about Stephen. He's a good man. But yeah, so you sort of go into it thinking you're supporting, the next stage, I suppose, of supporting your community, because having been a governor at schools, I then became a board director at Eastbourne Homes, which looks after all the social housing, which I really enjoyed, which then obviously impacts, so a school community might impact a few hundred families. Being on the board at Eastbourne Homes impacts 3,700 families that live in social housing. And then I thought, well, actually, it'd be quite nice to do something a bit bigger and better and have a greater impact. So becoming a councillor then, obviously with 100,000 residents, so the plan was set. And I got elected in 2015 as an Old Town councillor.
And you've been elected, and you were elected again in
2019.
2019.
Yeah, so which I was and that was probably my biggest applaud, in the sense that I think on that election I got the most votes out of any borough councillor, which I know it's different because each ward is different, but I felt a real sense of resident support, I suppose is how I put it. I'm not trying to make a point about the number of votes, but I felt then the residents probably, or seemed to feel, that I was doing a good job and I was open, honest, transparent, and knew what I stood for, and that I did my level best to get things done.
And I mean, how in fact do you connect with your constituents, as it were, or the people in your ward? How do you feel that connection occurs? What do you have to do to maintain it?
Well, there's some proactive things you can do. You can door knock, and you can put flyers through the door, and you can there's certain flyers that we put through which request feedback, and they can almost fill it out and then put it back through the letterbox, and you go and pick it up an hour later, kind of thing. I suppose that the door knocking for me was always a bit of a challenge, because I'm married with 3 kids, and at the time I always thought, God, we're knocking on doors at 6 o'clock in the evening when people should be feeding their children, having family time, and we're interrupting it, saying anything you want to talk about. And so I was never a great one for canvassing, as it's called, because I always felt it was a massive inconvenience. I felt that people didn't really enjoy that. But equally, I also get the argument that not everybody is up to date with computers and technology, and so social media doesn't suit everybody, which I totally agree with and understand. But so you can do it through proactive measures like knocking on doors and going to and being involved in community groups, whether it's Old Town Rec, or the trustees of Treeborn, or whatever. And equally, you can be reactionary, so you can wait for residents to contact you when they have a problem, which obviously everything is a matter of public record, so they can go on the internet, they can search up my name, and they can get my mobile number, and they can call me direct. And then you can react to that and support them. And one of those occasions was the youth hostel, McKendrick House, up in my ward. I got involved because residents were being disturbed, and so that kind of relationship develops, and we work well with the residents to try and work with Downslink to ensure that it's a happy community, that the residents at the YMCA are living in tandem and harmony with the residents who surround them. And that was probably a 2-year piece of work. So you get to know people, and consequently, I suppose, they talk and more people get in touch.
So, I mean, it's got a lot of dedication behind it. I mean, bear in mind what you just said about the reality was that it was not 5 hours a week, but 25 or 30 hours a week. How did that expectation, and was that a surprise, and how did it affect your family? Because, I mean, you talked about, working. That's a lot of hours to put on top of working anyway. Yeah.
So I suppose when you're originally elected a borough councillor, and your casework, if you like, isn't really, I'm probably exaggerating slightly, and say it's 25, 30 hours a week. It might have been 15, 20 back then. And as you're settling in and getting to know things, and you're getting put on committees. So you're then having to read lots of papers as well. So there's lots of stuff involved in that. It's when you become a portfolio holder, so you sit on the cabinet, which I did when I got offered the place services, which looked after the environment, parks, recreation, maintenance, and so on. And it's quite a big portfolio. And then you suddenly realise you're sitting in a number of meetings, you're doing a lot of reading, a lot of work, and it's 35 hours almost comfortably, really. Which obviously is hard, but having run my own business, I've always worked hard, so it was not really a problem from the hours. But there's definitely an impact where you make conscious choices about the commitment you've made to Eastbourne Borough Council and to the residents, which probably, in some way, although my personal values are family, business, community in that order, actually it ended up being community, business, family for a short period, until you have to then recognise you're getting this wrong, and you need to take a step back and say, right, this isn't suiting my happiness, my own personal joy, if you like. And I remember one case where we had a Liberal Democrat manifesto day, which we were writing a manifesto for the 2019 election. And the only day in the month that we could do as a group was the 10th of July, which was my son's birthday. And that was it. It was expected. I was a portfolio holder. It was expected I was there. So I missed my entire day with my son, which is obviously a constant source of regret for me, because I feel very sad about it when I talk about it. But you get carried along, don't you, with the rhythm of the choices you make. And then at a point where you have some time to breathe, you think, actually, I don't think I've got this balance quite right. I need to make some changes here. This isn't quite fair. And then, of course, you can be hopefully big enough to be able to say, well, actually, I can't do that. So thanks for asking, but no, I'm fully committed now.
And I mean, that sort of ebb and flow, as you say, managing those boundaries must be more difficult, as you said, when you become a portfolio holder and you take on other responsibilities. But also, I mean, bear in mind, sort of elected 2015 to 2019, the political climate has changed and social media has changed. Has that impacted on you, or how you feel about the work, or with your colleagues as well? I mean, political discourse is not
Yeah, I suppose it's
difficult at the moment.
Yeah, I suppose the upsetting thing for me is that I'm a fairly kind of tell it like it is kind of guy. That's how I sort of see myself, really. And I always saw that my role within the public domain would be that kind of character, that what you see is what you get, and if I can't do something, I will tell you I can't do it. I won't try and pretend I can do something that I can't, but it may be things that we can do that would mitigate and offset some of the challenges that would be ultimately helpful, but it wouldn't necessarily get to where you want to be. And because you've got a political climate that you have in central government, that people then tar all political, or what they would call politicians. I never really called myself a politician because I was a locally elected councillor. But if you put that in the term, we're all tarred with the same brush, which is really disappointing and really upsetting, because you think there are a lot of good people locally who do a lot of good work that isn't recognised. And what is recognised in the same way as news is only really news when it's bad news because people are interested in that. It's the same locally. So the press really would rather report on something that's controversial and which makes it more interesting by definition than the good stuff that people do. And I suppose ultimately then you sort of feel you can only do this for so long, because it becomes, after a period of time, a little bit upsetting, a little bit demotivating that it's not just me, but lots of people are doing lots of good stuff. And actually there's an air of criticism about the things that we don't do rather than the good things that we do. Yeah.
No, I can understand that. And in terms of the, you talked about the time commitment and the impact. I mean, and obviously, fairly recently you've made a decision to leave the Lib Dem group and become an independent councillor, and that was largely around the decision of the council to continue with Airborne, although I look at the wording sometimes and I still doesn't seem whether it's definitely still going ahead in 2023, but can you explain a little bit about your thoughts from that and how the situation arose?
Yeah, so I suppose, as I said, I like to think I'm a man of my word, and I gave a commitment when I was lead member for climate change, after we proposed the climate emergency motion in 2019, that we gave a commitment to the environment, and it's difficult because the central government create rules around which local authorities effectively have to obey. And I don't say those words lightly. I mean, if you think about something like the planning inspectorate in Bristol, I mean, that's been conceived to ensure that local authorities provide planning permission for large developments that actually they may not think is in the best interest of their local area. So the builder can then, if it's been declined 3 times, can then appeal to the planning inspectorate, and they can then investigate and they can overrule it. And there are lots of cases where things have happened which aren't necessarily in the best interest of the local authority. And so you have these sort of rules around which local authorities have to conform to, which restrict our impact and restrict us from doing the things that actually would be in the best interest of Eastbourne, or at best make it very, very difficult for us to do that. So when it comes to something like Airborne, you've got a number of factors. You've got tourism, which I understand is of lifeblood of a seaside town. We'd had COVID, which obviously had impacted enormously on businesses, including my own. So I was well aware, having grown a business for 30 years and made 65 people redundant, I'm very well aware of the huge impact on people. But equally, if you are going to make a commitment, and it's a unanimous commitment within local authority, that both sides, the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, and I only say that because there aren't any Labour councillors, but if there were, it was a unanimous vote, that we voted to commit to the climate emergency motion. That meant that in my mind, there are certain decisions now you can't take. You cannot run events like Airborne unless they are going to be carbon neutral. And it's wasn't in my mind good enough to say that we are going to run this event as carbon neutral event by 2030. We need to be doing things now and making significant changes. In the same way that we needed more funding to create bus lanes to have a more improved transport service, which we don't really have any control over because Stagecoach own the bus service, the Highways Authority is the county council, and central government provide all the funding. And so there's a limit to what you can physically achieve. What we can do is try and raise that profile. But the things that we can directly impact, I think we should be doing. And I don't think we should be using the argument that we are moving Airborne towards a carbon neutral event, but we also need to run it for the benefit of tourism. Because we didn't say when we did the climate emergency motion, we are committing to this as long as it's okay with tourism.
No, that's right. And in fact, in the climate emergency strategy, there is a commitment to have a tourism decarbonisation plan, which was red flagged as being delayed, and I think it's absolutely true that where tourism occurs, and if that tourism has a significant level of emissions, which clearly cars, vehicle transport visiting Airborne would do, then that has to be taken into consideration as part of the plan and the carbon reduced. And so, I mean, and I'm not sure if in the calculations, because my reading of the situation at present is that there hasn't yet been a calculation for the carbon emissions from Airborne for this year. So that there isn't actually a figure yet that says, well, this is what it actually has emitted, and therefore how can you commit to reduce that when you don't know how much it actually has already emitted?
Yeah, and that was one of the challenges when it went to scrutiny, was that decisions were being voted for about the continuation of Airborne without the full facts, because it was still in draft. And whilst Airborne still hasn't been agreed, because it's still got a couple more processes to go through, the fact that all the councillors within the scrutiny committee were voting to continue with Airborne sent slight shivers up my spine, if I'm honest, because I attended the meeting to put to remind us all that we made this commitment. Let's not forget this commitment. We can't change our mind, because when you make a commitment, you see it through. The commitment wasn't wrong. It wasn't like we'd worked on a whole load of data that turned out to be incorrect. We'd made this commitment, and now we're doing things that are contrary to that commitment, which is very difficult, because I personally felt like I was lying. I mean, you and I, Miles, worked together in the climate strategic panel, and whilst I always was owned up to the fact that this was a challenging path that we were taking, and there were no easy answers, and it was going to take a lot of partnership working, we were making some headway, but there were certain things that we couldn't necessarily directly impact other than to lobby and to raise the profile of the conversation. So we I'm not hiding from the fact that there's any easy answers here, but we're not making it any easier by continuing to do things that are contrary to the commitments we've already made. That to me seems ludicrous.
Yeah, and so it was. So in terms of your own point of view, your own position, it was a matter of integrity.
Well, it was. Yeah. I mean, I'm a father of three, and I want above all my children to know that honesty is a huge criteria. I mean, you have to be above all truthful, and even if, I say to my children, if you've done something wrong, lying about it makes it 10 times worse. If you told the truth, okay, there may be some consequences to bad behaviour, bad decisions, whatever it might be, but actually being honest about it means we can actually help get through that. And so I don't want to lie to anybody, and I felt that I was being put in a difficult position when, as lead member for climate change, our group voted for the continuation of Airborne. I then thought, well, actually, I'm better off. I could impact I could change this argument more powerfully by sticking with it. But actually, when it went to scrutiny, I realised that cross-party votes were 100% unanimous that they were continuing with Airborne at that point. I thought, I'm sort of losing the argument here, which is disappointing. And now I suppose I don't want to align myself with those groups when I don't believe that's the right thing to do.
No. And I mean, you're not. And do you think that if the decision, which seems to be likely, that Airborne does continue, that that will disable the achievement of carbon neutrality by 2030? It seems to make it extremely difficult.
Well, as you and I both know, when we worked together at the Climate Strategic Partnership, we recognised that 95% of carbon neutrality delivery was going to be delivered by residents. They were going to make changes, or we were encouraging and promoting changes in each other's lifestyles to reduce our carbon footprint as individuals and as families. So to say that on the public domain and then vote for something that is contrary to that sends mixed messages, and is no different, in my opinion, to the central government MPs that do exactly the same thing that I'm so openly critical of.
Yeah. So it's leadership as well.
Yeah, I mean, leading by example. I mean, I wouldn't say that I came into politics being a particularly green environmentalist at all. I mean, I always think I'd like to leave the planet in a better condition than I found it in. But it wasn't something. I wasn't a green campaigner. I wasn't a member of the Green Party. But it's more about, I enjoyed that role. I enjoyed the challenge, and I enjoyed the people I was working with, whether they're residents, community groups, councillors. And I felt that people were coming from it from the same level of sincerity and commitment. So I made a few small changes in my life. I sold my car, I walk everywhere, and I found actually I quite enjoyed that. And I then started building more time in my day to say, right, if I've got to get to that meeting there, and it's 30 minutes walk, it's a 10-minute drive, I've got to allow 30 minutes now. And actually I found that planning of my day, my own personal welfare and well-being, an enjoyable process to go through. So little things like that we made changes to do, to then agree or vote for this enormous event that creates enormous pollution, when I'm trying to do this very, very small thing, like reduce my carbon footprint by reducing by selling the car I own and walking everywhere and cycling or whatever and taking public transport. It's negated, almost a million times. I mean, it's just incredible. It's just a complete. Even I felt it's just crazy. It's not worth doing. And you think, well, what a shame, but I want to do it. I want to make my personal commitment, because this is about individuals doing their own thing and living their lives with their own conscience. And I felt my conscience meant I'd like to do as much as I can. I know I can't live a carbon neutral life, and I've got a house and I've got a heating, I've got to have hot water and all the things. I've got young children and so on. And I've got a dog, which also I found out was quite a polluter. Who'd have known having a pet was quite a polluter on the WWF scale? But it is. But we are where we are. What I suppose we need to do is each of us think, well, what can I do? What can I achieve this year that reduces my carbon footprint? And then what can I do next year? And whilst I see that's the process that Airborne is going through, it's such a significant opportunity that I think we missed it. I think we missed the opportunity of saying, we are making a stand. We will find other events that support the tourism. What we can't do is have 1 million people driving to Eastbourne in cars, parking, sitting in traffic, idling, and then having great big fighter jets flying over Eastbourne, when on the flip side, we're trying to say we all need to be green and environmentally conscious and reduce our carbon footprint. It's complete mixed messages in the most extreme case.
Yeah. No, I can see that. Do you think there's any chance that, you said about the process isn't totally finished in terms of Airborne's evaluation, do you think there's any chance that on evaluation, when the actual measurements are given and the impact is known, that it won't continue? Or do you think really it's fait accompli already?
I suppose I don't know the answer to that, if I'm perfectly honest with you. I think there are, as I say, I fundamentally believe that every councillor in Eastbourne Borough Council is a good person. I think they come from it from the right point of view, where they want to positively benefit the community in which they live in. Some of us just have different ideals about how we're going to achieve that. And we're aligned to different political parties because of our own personal values. So I'd like to think, so saying that, I think some people are saying, well, we need to know the facts and figures before we can make a definite decision. And so there will be people who might well vote differently when those facts and figures come out. It's just that on an event that's run for several decades, you sort of think, well, we have a lot of facts and figures and we could make more effort into getting that data, and we could have made a lot more effort into getting that data in 2022, which would have made the scrutiny panel a bit more informed when they came to making that decision. So we're missing opportunities at every stage here, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, I understand that. Well, I guess we'll see, won't we? But
we will.
And, take it forward from there. So you're now an independent.
Yep.
And actually one of 3 independents on the council
yes.
now, because the first independent was Tony Freebody, I think.
It was.
Who stepped down from the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
And then your colleague Steve Wallace stepped down, primarily over Airborne as well, fairly recently. So do you think this is part of a trend? Do you think there could be, because we've got an election next May for local government, so do you think there is a possibility that people may stand as independents, that there might be more independent-minded, non-party political councillors?
I hope there is. I mean, as I say, I've never been particularly political. I came into it because I like the idea of supporting my community, I suppose, and helping out, and I suppose there's another benefit to that in terms of my children have then perhaps seen that I hadn't anticipated. And then they went on school council and they've got involved and can be seen as probably little busybodies now, But I think having got elected and taken more of an interest in the political scene, and then subsequently read certain books and articles, I quite like the idea of local authorities being independents, all of them. I mean, whether or not we should not be politically aligned in any way, shape or form, we should stand as independents. Residents could then vote for the person that had the values that most aligned to theirs, or the commitments in terms of how they see their priorities, whether it's environment, financial, commercial, whatever it might be. And then we're not in any way persuaded to vote for a particular topic because there is a national party agenda. Yeah. We can be free.
Yeah. And I mean, I looked the other day, and you're probably aware, but there's been a significant increase in the number of independent councillors in the UK over the last 5 years. I mean, there's over 2,000 now. And in fact, there's even a few councils where the majority are independent. I was looking at one, Ashfield in Nottinghamshire, which has got, I think, 28 independent councillors out of 35 councillor positions.
Brilliant. Right.
So I think, and I saw another thing on some polling, which said that more young people were of the opinion that they would vote for independent councillors because they saw less relevance in party politics at a local level. And, so I do wonder if that actually might appeal to parts of the electorate at a local level that wouldn't have voted for either political party in Eastbourne. Well, I think we've got to vote for an independent.
I think whatever happens, we've got to do something that stops the apathy that's currently at the polls. And that was another reason, standing down from being a Liberal Democrat councillor to being an independent, is I felt that we were contributing towards that apathy, because people would then say, well, what do you stand for? If you're saying this 2 years ago and now you're voting this way now, there's that really big challenge, isn't there? That, well, if I vote for you because I know what you stand for, but actually you're delivering something else, why would I want to vote for you again? So I can't be bothered. And I've got a couple of friends who are my age, and I'm 50, and I remember when they voted for Brexit, it was the first time they'd ever voted in their lives. And we happened to be out for dinner, and I didn't know this. They had never voted. We'd never talked about politics. And it happened to come up around the table, and one of them said, oh, well, it's the first time I ever voted was for Brexit. I said, what, you'd never voted in an election? No, never. Oh, right, why is that? He said, well, what difference does it make? I said, well, why vote for Brexit? Well, I think that's unbelievably important topic, and I needed to have my voice heard. And then the friend sitting next to me, the other side, said, "Yeah, I'm the same." I said, "What? You've never voted again?" And both of them, I tell you, I kid you not, had never voted. And of course, because of the shambles of Brexit, they said it was so chaotic they'd never vote again now, because even that didn't really seem to make any difference. And you think, well, how disappointing is that? That we've got this apathy in the polls, and you can see why young people are thinking, well, I don't know who to vote for. I don't know what anyone stands for now. And you've only got to see it over the last couple of years. And I'm not making a political point about the Conservatives, but the Conservative Party is slightly in turmoil at the moment. How can anyone really know what you're getting? And I suppose I could argue the same with Nick Clegg and the university fees. In fairness to the Conservatives, we said one thing and then we went in and then we voted differently when we were in power. And those things hurt us for decades, generations, certainly. People remember stuff for a long time. So I think to try and change the apathy, stop the people avoiding polling day, but actually contribute towards it positively, there might have to be a cultural shift. Something dramatic's got to happen, because having 30% of people who are voting seems ridiculous to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it seems really sad. And it's upsetting that there's people then who go around vocalising, moaning, whatever you might say, on social media and in conversation. Oh, this isn't what it should be. But did you vote? Well, no. Well, you didn't have your say. So it's very difficult, isn't it? It's really, really challenging. And I want people to vote, because I think there are countries that don't have that opportunity.
Well, it really does matter, doesn't it? It really does matter. And also I think from within local authorities, low turnouts will only fuel centralised power in government, national governments, who think, well, we can do very much what we like with local authorities because so few people vote in them. Yeah. And whereas I think if there was a democratic upsurge with local authorities, it would empower local authorities. So, we're moving towards this budget next week where, it's quite likely, quite possible that public funding will be cut again. And, you look around and you say, well, where? How? And I think that the power of democracy by people voting is a stop to say, no, we value these services, which would strengthen the position of local authorities with national governments. And you've talked a bit. We talked very early on there about the difference between Eastbourne Borough Council, East Sussex County Council, what things are under the power of Eastbourne and what things are under the power of East Sussex. And I think people do find it very confusing as to which one is responsible for what. And I know you've talked about, I think, being an advocate for a unity authority. So could you explain a little bit about what that is and how you think it might be a benefit to somebody living in Eastbourne?
Yeah, so interesting you talk about what people understand. I remember on the first time I stood for election, I met somebody that I know, and her husband had a conversation with me and clearly didn't understand what he was voting for. He thought he was voting for Stephen Lloyd at the time. And I said, no, this is a local borough council election. You're voting for the 3 councillors, of which there are 9 wards, 3 councillors in each ward, 27 councillors for Eastbourne Borough Council. And I mentioned it to my wife, and she said, well, I wouldn't have known. And it's only the fact that you're involved and you talk about it that even I know what it's all about, to be honest with you. So it is slightly complex, but in Eastbourne, we have Eastbourne Borough Council as a local authority that is responsible for parks and gardens and waste, really. The East Sussex County Council is responsible for highways, schools, education, health, and so on. And so any big ticket items, Eastbourne Borough Council has very little impact on because it doesn't have the control. So a unitary authority would allow Eastbourne Borough Council to be in charge of every aspect of its town, from collecting the waste through to social services and healthcare and so on, and how we distribute those funds that we would receive per capita. the strategic control that central government have is, as you mentioned earlier, is they've reduced the budgets that local authorities receive, which means we then have even less opportunity to make decisions because we now have a reduced amount of money. In the same way that they changed the rules about unitary authorities. So unitary authorities, anyone could have applied for it originally, but then you have to have a community or a residence base of 300,000 plus. Well, Eastbourne has 105,000 residents. So in order for us now to apply for a unitary authority, we'd need to merge with perhaps Polegate, West Ham, start taking a few bits out of Wealdon Council because we're entirely enveloped by Wealdon District Council. Yeah. So we're naturally going to impact them. They may not want to lose those residents in East Dean and Seaford and so on. So we're now between a really big rock and a hard place because how do you ever achieve a unitary authority where the people the residents vote for at the polls in a local election actually have responsibility to manage the town?
So it's very difficult, isn't it? Because, I mean, for us locally, I suppose the nearest unity authority is Brighton and Hove, isn't it? So they have this control autonomy over bigger areas and a bigger budget. Would our unitary authority be Lewis, Eastbourne and bits of Wealdon to get, it'd have to be, wouldn't it, to get to 300,000?
Well, yeah, I mean,
roughly.
It would depend how wide you spread it. But if you went from Eastbourne across to Seaford and Newhaven and Lewis, it will be a wide area anyway. Yeah, I mean, it'd be 3 times where we're at now in terms of resident base. And obviously, we've got quite a lot of land, haven't we? I mean, between here and East Dean, it's all farmland. You know, so it's not just 5 miles, is it? It's going to be 20, 25 miles. And you've got to take the residents with you. You want it to be something that people believe. And because we are reducing our opportunity to impact positively in the environment that we serve, or the authority we serve, people see that critically. They think, well, actually, you know, you're not doing that great a job over here. Why would I want you to start looking after me? And there's this whole bigger picture that actually with size comes a greater sense of control, a greater sense of ownership. There might be, dare I say, greater remuneration for councillors. So you won't just get people like me who happen to put their hand up. You'll get people who are highly qualified and highly experienced and far more experienced than I am to actually stand in roles. And if you look at the Canadian system, where you have an MP who's the portfolio holder or the cabinet member for education, ex-university or headmaster, head of health is a doctor. And so we have people who are experts in their fields. Whereas at the moment, obviously within most local authorities, you rely heavily on the goodwill of the residents who put their hand up and say, I don't mind standing for election.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at councillors' allowances and they're not really very generous. I mean, they're not very much in terms of what councillors get allowed to receive in terms of income and a fixed allowance. And you think for the hours that are put in, divided into that allowance. But if you look wider, does that impact on the type of people that can step forward to become councillors? Because you can only do it if you're subsidised in another way. Absolutely.
So hence you get people who are either can afford to take the time off work. So I was fortunate I had my own business and I had staff that worked within that, and that allowed me some time to take off to be able to do my council role. Or you get people who are perhaps carers or parents with children at home who are then off work anyway and feel they could dedicate some time. But primarily, you get retired people who are saying, I'd like to give back to my community now. I've worked hard. I've done what I set out to do. I've now got my pension. I'm happy to commit. And so consequently in Eastbourne, we receive roughly £2,500 a year as a councillor. As a cabinet member, you get around £4,500, £5,000. So it's pretty much doubled. But as a cabinet member, you're getting £5,000 allowance for 30 to 35 hours of work a week. And you're getting the £5,000 per year. And it's called an allowance because obviously it can't be called a remuneration because it's below minimum wage. So it's very much the allowance is to cover your costs for getting to and from meetings in effect. So if you live in the harbour and you had to go to the town hall for a meeting and you have to get the bus, it effectively contributes towards your £2.50 bus fare. You can't then subsequently claim unless you go out of the borough for expenses. But generally, and I suspect most councillors like me, that didn't really ever put in a claim because it was such a nominal amount of money. I don't mean that. I know there's a cost of living crisis, and I don't want to demean that, but there is a point where you think, well, I'm going to fill out all these forms to claim for £5 worth of train fare, or £8.50 to go to Bexhill or Hastings, which was a common journey for me. And it's going to take me probably 30 minutes to an hour to fill out the forms and go through the process. Well, my commitment is to my community. I'm not going to worry about that too much. And so you do rely on people who say, I'm doing this for the best of reasons. But what we really want to have is a remunerated role where people who are the best people to serve the community are then putting their hands up, not just the most willing.
Yes, and on those that can afford to.
Yeah, and so I've got a friend who I think will be an outstanding councillor, absolutely brilliant. And he's the main breadwinner for his family. So for him to become a councillor, he would have to give up at least one day of work a week. Well, on that basis, it would need to be something like £10,000 a year remuneration to cover the reduction in his own salary that he would therefore get because he'd only been doing 4 days a week.
Yeah.
And we're nowhere near that. So, I within our group, I was always a big advocate of we need to remunerate this properly. Not because I wanted to win at this. I'm standing down in May, so I'm not going to benefit from this. But I think moving forward, you've got to be able to create more people who are interested in becoming councillors. And the way you do that is by making it a role that's desirable. And one of those characteristics, I'm not saying it's entirely about money, but one of those characteristics will be, what is the remuneration? Can I afford to do this?
Yeah. And I think that would then bring diversity in, and that would be more intergenerational potentially, because wouldn't it be good? I know you have had fairly young councillors in the past, but wouldn't it be good to have more and have a greater representation across age groups?
Just to add to that, and without speaking out of turn, we had this debate within our group, and Josh Babarindi, who's a fantastic councillor, and I have absolutely every confidence he will be a fantastic MP. He is a man of integrity, so I think for me he ticks that box every time. But when I said to him, why didn't you become a councillor before, bearing in mind you grew up in Eastbourne and you went to Cavendish, he said, well, because it wouldn't even have covered my train fare back from London when I was setting up my social enterprise called Cracked It, for which he got an OBE. I said, well, isn't that desperately sad for Eastbourne that we've missed out on 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years of Josh Babarindi being this awesome councillor because he couldn't even have afforded to pay his train fare to get back for council meetings from when he was living in London setting up his social enterprise.
Yeah.
And you think, that must tell you everything you need to know.
Well, it's a loss of talent, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And I think, and we were talking earlier about independence, and maybe that would lead to more people getting involved, and therefore, more people voting, and maybe more talent would occur because of that, really. So just looking ahead, what's your vision for the town? What would you really like to see, the top sort of 5, 6 items that for the next few years, the foreseeable future, you'd like to see Eastbourne become to be a better place? Well,
my wife's got an electric vehicle, so top of my list is EV charging points. I just think it's crazy that you are never going to get residents to convert to electric vehicles, which are now much more affordable than they ever were before. You can get an electric vehicle for £20,000-25,000, which is not dissimilar to the combustion engines you could also buy. But if you can't charge it, and we're a Victorian town, and you've only got to think of roads like Ashford Road, Cavendish Place, Eversfield Road, the Avenue, all these sort of high density populated areas, how are people going to charge their vehicles? So there's got to be facilities there within public car parks, on-street charging points, and so on. So for me, I think that's a prerequisite. I think I'd like to see a much larger commitment to the whole environmental agenda in terms of making sure we understand the carbon impact and the climate impact of decisions that we take. So it's not just has it been considered, but actually what is actually the impact of this? And do we know that this is going to reduce our carbon footprint, or is it going to increase it? If it is going to increase it, because we've got to have buildings, we've got to build houses, we've got to build buildings for residents, and those families that are desperately trying to get accommodation but are living currently in bedsits in Jevington Gardens. So we've got to think about the whole breadth of our community. But if we're going to make decisions that are beneficial in one area, how are we going to offset that? What are we going to do differently? And a lot of those decisions, like Alan Shuttleworth does within the buildings projects and decarbonising the housing stock, they're really positive. There's lots of buildings going up now that have the lowest environmental impact that we've ever seen, and will continue to do that because they're so well insulated, they're so well heated, and I just think that there's some really excellent opportunities at the moment within that area, because the government is putting enormous pressure on local authorities to continue to build, and we all know how devastating concrete is when it comes to buildings. But there are concrete mixtures that you can buy in Southampton that are 20% of the carbon footprint, but they're equally probably 5 times the cost. But if they're not the 5 times the cost, they're certainly a heck of a lot more expensive than normal concrete. And so, people have got to get the motivation and in some cases get the funding. And so this is very much about central government getting behind the rhetoric, getting behind the messages they say they talk about. They've got to actually deliver that, because it becomes pointless otherwise. It's just talk. Which is disappointing for people like me who are at the bottom end of it in a local authority that desperately want to see positive change in the community they live in, but actually there's not really any funding to do that. No. So consequently, the EV charging points, as case in point, are really slow in coming out, and there are some developments that go on that ultimately do get put in, but we're talking about 2 or 3 in number. I went to Taunton with work on last Monday, and I used my wife's electric vehicle. And I went to Oxford Services, huge service station. There are a bank of about 15 Tesla chargers, and we haven't got a Tesla. We've got a Hyundai Nero. And there's 2 chargers for the fit the car that I'm driving. One of which is out of order, and the other one is being used. And you think, well, out of all the cars going up and down the M40, and there's one charging point, effectively.
It is about having that, enabling the on-street charging to catch up with the growth of EVs. I mean, one of the other points, to go back to my point I was talking about earlier about the food bank and the future. I mean, I was, and I am still quite shocked that the food bank is providing emergency food to over 2,000 people a month in Eastbourne. And how do you think we can reduce those numbers and deal with some of the deprivation and poverty that we've got in the town? What sort of strategies or policies can we have to help people now, but try and make the economy fairer in its distribution of wages? I mean, an opportunity.
Well, I definitely think the windfall tax would have been a good start, wouldn't it? I mean, it seems incredulous that you've got companies every night on the news. Shell, BP made £7 billion profit in the first quarter, or whatever the huge numbers are. Don't quote me on that, but they were significant numbers, and they're double what they made last year. And yet we're doing very, very little, in my opinion. We're taking away the restrictions that were otherwise in place for things like your standing charge. I mean, why is the standing charge doubled? I mean, it seems to me to be ridiculous. I mean, totally unfair. That even if you were somebody on a low income and you thought, I'm going to be really careful with my gas and my electricity, your standing charge is still doubled. That's horrendous. Yeah. I think that's awful. And so the central government are making decisions that directly penalise those on lowest incomes. So until you've got a government that says we've got to nurture the people on lowest incomes and look after them because we need them to be totally self-sufficient, which these people want to be, but when you're creating a set of rules that stop them from having that level of independence, it's very, very difficult. So you consequently then get food banks, don't you, where you get good-willed, good-natured members of the community to say, well, let's set up a food bank. Let's help those on lowest incomes. Let's help those who are struggling the most. But again, this is really should be a government support, the government should be supporting these people, not residents.
Well,
but it's lovely that residents do, but there is something dreadfully wrong, isn't there?
Well, I think one of the volunteers I spoke to at the food bank actually said it feels like this is becoming a shadow social service.
Yeah, exactly that.
And I think mentioned that even when social services, say for example, need a pram, they'll come to the food bank. And it just seems that we're normalising levels of poverty and deprivation that we shouldn't in 2022 accept in one of the wealthiest countries of the world. It just...
We set up in Old Town in our ward. Helen Burton was the main starter for a community fridge, but we then set one up in Old Town, which Peter Diplock and his wife were heavily involved in and did a fantastic job. I mean, absolutely brilliant. And I went along a few Wednesdays when it ran from 9 till 11. And this is food that would otherwise go to waste. So it's free from that point of view in terms of a supermarket is going to get rid of it. And there are families that go there and you think, it's frightening, isn't it? That these people live in your community, in your road, that you'll be otherwise unaware that they're struggling to such a level that they can't feed their children. And I find that extraordinary. And there is a level of helplessness that I feel that I don't believe that I'm particularly qualified to assist in that, other than trying to do some community work and trying to do some good stuff by helping out as part of being a councillor. But there's some fundamental, strategic, cultural change that needs to happen to ensure that these things don't happen in this country.
Yes. Probably means a change of government, I would suggest.
Well, quite possibly. And but the government we change to has got to be, if it makes those commitments, has got to deliver on them.
Yep.
There's no point saying, oh, actually, we promised that, but we just realised we can't quite afford it, so we can't do it.
No.
You know, do your research. So when the Labour government are being criticised for having unbudgeted manifestos, well, you've got to make sure that it's budgeted. I'm not saying that they are unbudgeted, because the Labour MPs would argue that it's all been costed. But it's got to be delivered as well. And you've got to have your key highlighted plans and ensure that you can afford to deliver them. Yeah. Because it's not good enough to keep having people in positions of authority saying we're going to do this and then we're not.
No. And that's been one of your recurrent themes today.
Yeah.
You know, it is about delivery, and it's about what we promised to deliver and then delivering what we have promised to deliver.
And if we can't deliver because the world's changed, let's be really open and honest about it. But there are things that nothing's really changed. We just don't really want to deliver it because now we found a bigger priority. So if you can find, forgive me, but the HS2, and I'm sure people say, oh, it's a different kind of budget, it's a different revenue and capital and all the rest of it, other arguments that people might come out with. But if you can spend billions on that and cut down ancient woodlands and destroy homes and destroy villages, then to save 20 minutes to get from London to Birmingham, surely there's more that we could do. I don't want to be facetious about it because I know there are bigger decisions, but it is important that we look after those who are most in need to ensure that they become self-sufficient so they don't stay in a position of in need.
Yeah, exactly. And we develop a strong enough economy and a diversified economy, and one that pays reasonable and good wages, and is sustained and sustainable, and not a sort of trickle-down approach, because, everybody knows it doesn't work. It really doesn't. So anything else, we'll sort of bring it to a close, but anything else in Eastbourne that you'd like to see happen in the next year or so?
Well, I'd love to see Treeborn go from strength to strength. I think it's a wonderful organisation that I'm particularly enthused by that, because they are doing stuff. They are planting 14,000 trees last year, they got funding for 1,000 street trees this year. So I really like to see Treeborn flourish, and I'd like to see other resident-led initiatives like that take action and show that actually we can benefit our community by partnership working, by group working, by people getting involved and making positive change, rather than some of the social media stuff where you see people moaning and just whinging about why things are the way they are. There's a lot of good stuff about Eastbourne. It's a wonderful town, isn't it? I mean, I've been here 40 50 years, and my children will be raised here. My wife comes from Cumbria, which is the most beautiful county, but chooses to live here. She never wants to go back to Cumbria when she came here. She loves it here, and it's brilliant. And so that, for me is lovely that we've made our home here, and our kids love the fact they've got the downs on one side and the seafront on the other. So we've got to look after the town and make sure that we do the very best for it. But it is lots of opportunity. We've just got to show that we can, do it in line with protecting and supporting the most vulnerable and those who need it, whilst enjoying the splendour of the area we live in.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode. Remember, we have elections for Eastbourne Borough Council next May, so ensure that you're registered to vote. It really matters. On the air show, why not have your say? In the links for this episode, we've provided further background on the show and its possible impacts. Feel free to comment below and/or to contact your local councillor to give your opinion on whether it should go ahead or not.